All right, I think we will go ahead and get started here. Again, as a reminder, this is being recorded and we'll be posting it to our YouTube channel afterwards so that folks can review these materials at any time or tune in if you weren't able to make it today. Thanks so much for coming. We're really excited to have you here. My name is Katie Grishak, and I am the coordinator of the Northwest Michigan Invasive Species Network. Joining me today is Emily Cook, our outreach specialist, and she's going to be kind of monitoring the chat for questions. So if at any time you have questions, please type them in the chat, and then she'll interrupt me and get those questions to me so that we can discuss them. A lot of times, you know, when we do this presentation live, there's a lot more chance for it to be a discussion, and it's a lot harder on Zoom, but we still want to facilitate that. We also have another ISN staff member, Shelly Stussick, who's our Go Beyond Beauty specialist. So really excited to have both of them here. And again, very excited to have you here. So with that, I'm going to get started on our identification workshop, part 1. We are holding an in-person portion of this in 2 weeks. There's one in Grand Traverse County and one in Manistee County. And I believe we might still have some spots open for those. So get in contact with Emily Cook if you are interested in attending those. But in the meantime, we're hoping that this will be like an okay standalone for not seeing the plants in person. So our kind of agenda for today, what to expect. I'm going to give a little bit of background and overview on the Invasive Species Network itself, and also a background on our messaging, how we talk about invasive species and the work that we're doing. And I think that a lot of that is going to be pretty applicable no matter what organization you work for. You know, you don't have to use ISN's approved messaging, but I think it is a good start to you when you're talking with other folks about invasive species. And then we'll dive into the super fun part of identification. We'll talk about ISN's top 12 least wanted species, as well as some early detection species and awareness species, and then some other invasive species as well. We focus on our terrestrial plants, but there are lots of other invasive species it's very worth keeping an eye out for, no matter who you're working with. We'll also talk a little bit about some common treatments. We're not going to get into the weeds on this, but you know, we always get questions about, okay, there's all these invasive species, well, what do we do about them? And so I want to give you the tools to have some basic understanding about invasive species treatment. And then we'll also talk a lot about reporting, and specifically reporting with the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network, or MISIN. And then also going to try to point you in the direction of other resources as well to further your education. So that should be fun. And I did mention earlier, we do have a break built into this because it's a pretty long presentation. I think we are going to go pretty close to the 2 hours. We'll see. We'll see how many questions we get. So first up, invasive species messaging. A little bit first about the Invasive Species Network. We are a cooperative invasive species management area, or CISMA. And I'll talk more about CISMAs in a minute, but that cooperative part is really crucial to us. It's not just us staff members doing the work. We really rely on the expertise and the passion and the knowledge of many partners, over 60 partners, and particularly a steering committee, who members have their logos here that advise us. And we work in Benzie, Grand Traverse, Leelanau, and Manistee counties. And again, not only with these big organizations, but also with everything from federal partners like the Forest Service and the National Park Service and our tribal partners, all the way down to you know, a garden club or a private landowner just on their own. We want to work with everyone on invasive species, and I think we do a pretty okay job of that. We are funded mainly by grants through the Michigan Invasive Species Grant Program, which is a state grant, the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which is a federal grant, and we get that through a couple different partners. And then also the Good Neighbor Authority, which is a partnership between the U.S. Forest Service and the Michigan DNR. So we're really grateful for that. And then additionally, the generous donations and some cost share money as well. So that is where our funding comes from. I mentioned CISMAs, and I promised I would talk about them some more. Michigan is so lucky to be covered by CISMAs. And I just realized that this map is out of date, and I apologize because we have the Southern Michigan Invasive Species Team, and JLW, which is Jackson, Lenawee, and Washtenaw counties. So all of those areas have SISMAs, and in addition, the light blue in the Northeast has split into 2 groups. So sorry about the outdated map there, but there are folks like ISN all throughout the state working with partners on invasive species networks, on invasive species issues. There are also other groups like federal agencies, the state agencies, nonprofits, tribal owners, landowners, individuals, garden clubs, anybody can be working on invasive species. So there's a lot of us working together on that. Some of our current programs at ISN, as we work to protect, enhance, and promote our natural communities, include direct management on the ground, working to control invasive species or to find them if we aren't sure of where they are or we think they're expanding. And so we have a crew out on the ground right now pulling garlic mustard, and later they'll be treating swallowwort and Japanese knotweed and all sorts of other invasive species. We're this year really lucky to have an additional crew that's all about surveying. They're going to be going out and looking for more invasive species, but that 2-person team isn't going to be able to cover our whole 4-county area. So training you is a really big part of getting those eyes out in the field and looking for invasive species, because we need that information to make good management decisions. We also do a lot of outreach with presentations and physical resources and electronic resources and education, all of those kinds of things. We've been doing work bees, particularly about garlic mustard, and we have some coming up for baby's breath. And then we also do, as a part of our Go Beyond Beauty program, a Japanese barberry trade up. And Go Beyond Beauty is a really amazing voluntary program to remove invasive species from shelves, basically, working in partnership with businesses who agree to go above and beyond what the law says about selling stuff. And that's been working in our 4-county area. And last year we were awarded a grant from the state of Michigan to bring that program statewide. And that's Shelley's job. So I'm sure you'll hear more about Go Beyond Beauty in the future. All right, enough about ISN. And moving on to more of the actual messaging. One of the things that's really easy with invasive species is to get bogged down in like, oh, they're so bad, oh, they hurt everything. And it's really easy to get stuck in that and turn people off. So we try to think about how habitat matters. And habitat matters to people. We've seen so much in the last year, how much being outdoors matters to our mental health, as in addition to our physical health, of course. It also matters for wildlife. There are the deep and intricate food webs and partnerships between species that all depend on the habitat that they have. And then habitat also matters for Northwest Michigan and for our economy, whether that's tourism, people coming to our many beautiful natural areas to observe wildflowers or wildlife, and as well our agriculture, which depends so much on pollinators, which depends on our habitat. Our silvicultural or logging industry is also, you can't grow trees without habitat. And fishing and hunting, all of these things that people either come to the area, live in the area, or work in the area for are deeply rooted, if you pardon the pun, in the habitat that we have here. And everybody knows the story of the monarch butterfly, that this is beautiful butterfly. It migrates across, 2 to 3 countries. And it, as a caterpillar, can only survive eating milkweed species. It has this really, really close relationship. And we know also that our pollinators are deeply dependent on having flowers to pollinate that they can reach. Different pollinators need different kinds of flowers to pollinate. And these deep connections aren't unique to these 2 species or to these 2 groups. There are tons and tons of species with very close connections. Including a couple of these butterflies and moths, whether it's the double-toothed prominent, a very boring moth that is an amazing caterpillar that can only eat elm leaves, or the spicebush swallowtail, which is this glorious butterfly, and it can only eat spicebush and sassafras, 2 native shrubs. I mean, not only are these animals really incredible on their own, but they're also an important part of the food web. They are an incredible source of food for birds, particularly when they're feeding their nestlings. Almost all of our birds in North America feed their birds, they feed their babies exclusively insects. And caterpillars are particularly good because they're squishy and you can shove them down their throats really easy. So it's really, really crucial not only to have like beautiful butterflies to observe, but to have those creepy crawlies so that we can have the birds that we want. It takes thousands and thousands of caterpillars to raise a brood of chicks. And so it's absolutely crucial. Our native plants and our native insects have evolved together over bajillions of years. That's a scientific term. And so that our native trees in particular support hundreds of species of just butterflies and moths, not even considering all of the other insects that there are. And oaks in particular are fantastic. And you can see here those really close relationships. But when we have non-native species, a species from somewhere else in the world that is brought here, it takes a really long time. And even for something like invasive Phragmites that in its home range in Europe and Asia supports over 170 species, it only supports 5 species of herbivores here in North America. And it's been here for over 300 years. And so that's not a lot of baby birds. It's not a lot of butterflies, it's not a lot of herbivores just in general. And so we're really missing out when we have non-native species that don't support the food web, especially if they're invasive. So, okay, I said the word invasive. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page because a lot of people use the word invasive and we mean different things. So when I say invasive and when folks at ISN say invasive, we mean that it's non-native. So it's not from our area and it was brought here by humans. And generally speaking, we mean European descent, whether it's settlers or explorers or what have you, they're brought from somewhere else. It also, in order to become invasive, needs to have few natural predators. So we talked about our native monarch caterpillar and how they need the native milkweed, and they kind of keep each other in check. And there's examples of that elsewhere, but when we bring plants from somewhere else, we often release them from the predation that helps keep them in check. And then it needs to be able to do massive reproduction, whether that's by seeds or by rhizomes under the ground or along the ground or by fragments. There are a lot of different ways, including if it's not a plant, it might be by lots of eggs. But it needs to be able to reproduce pretty effectively in order to have a population that competes with other species. But when we think about the formal definition of invasive species, which is set down in US law, it is a non-native species that harms people, the environment, or the economy. So there's 2 parts to that. It has to be non-native and it has to do harm. So tulips are non-native, but they're not doing harm. Poison ivy is native, and you can argue certainly that it does harm to human health, but because of that native part, it doesn't meet the invasive requirement. As we work in invasive species, we're always trying to push towards the left side of this curve, this invasion curve. It's a lot easier and cheaper to get something early when you first find it and take that 1 garlic mustard and pull it than it is to wait until you have a huge amount of the thing. And now it's very expensive, very time consuming, very sanity consuming to handle all of those species. And all of those individuals. So definitely trying to push towards this earlier part of the graph where we can make a big difference. Doesn't mean it's not worth pulling this garlic mustard. It just means that particularly when we're working with grant funds, we're trying to focus on these winnable battles. But I pulled garlic mustard on my property and autumn olive and all of that stuff. So we always get questions about how these invasive species arrived. And so some of them, it was an accident. About 50% of our invasive plants were an accident, but the other 50% were brought here on purpose. Majority of them, particularly on our top list, I would say over half of the species on our top 12 were imported because we think they're really beautiful. And then they escape and cause problems. Sometimes it was super duper on purpose. In the case of autumn olive, this was something that conservation groups said, hey, this is a great plant for conservation, let's use it. And then it became a huge problem and got way out of hand and is causing a lot of issues there. And then some of them were imported for food or medicine. Every part of the garlic mustard plant is edible. And so it showed up in people's gardens on purpose because they were going to eat it. And then they decided spinach was cooler and stopped paying attention, and it was able to explode into our forests. So there's lots and lots of invasive species out there, and prioritizing is really crucial. So when ISN thinks about prioritization, we have a big, long document about how we do it. But when it comes down to it, we're looking at species that are impacting high quality habitats or have the ability to impact high quality habitats in a negative way. Thinking about those, again, that left side of that graph, what can we get early and make a big difference on without getting so tired that we fall down? Again, those species likely to do the most harm, certainly to our habitats, but also to human health. You know, if there's an invasive species that's causing harm to humans, that's a really big deal. And then thinking about, as far as prioritization, what are we trying to control, like go out and kill, and what are we trying to prevent? How can we help people and ourselves make a difference and not make things worse? So, you know, thinking about something like autumn olive here on the left, it's already quite ubiquitous. We're thinking more about stopping it from getting into those high quality habitats rather than trying to eradicate it across the population, across the landscape. Versus something like European frogbit, we don't have any of that in our area to the extent that we know, and there's not even that much in Michigan. So efforts are very much, you know, in other areas of Michigan are very much on the, whoa, let's hit this as hard as we can, because of that ability to really stop it in its tracks, hopefully. So I've mentioned our top 12 before, and we'll get into this more shortly, but we do have our top 12 species to help folks prioritize and see what we're focusing on the most. We also have a list of early detection and response species, and then some additional lists of awareness species. And those awareness species are divided up into type of habitat. So if someone's thinking about like, oh, what do I have in my field? We have like a field list. What's in the fields? What's in the wetlands? What's on the dunes? Just to help people know what they're looking at, because there are a lot of invasive species and we want to make it easier for folks. So we'll talk about all of them today, don't worry, but there's your little preview. And as you're talking with the public, you know, some of the takeaways that you might want to impart to them, it would depend, of course, on the person and the situation, but it's always great if they see something to report it. And we'll talk more about MISIN at the end. But reporting is absolutely crucial. If they know something and we don't know about it, that means that our decision-making process isn't taking their knowledge into account. And so we really want to know about it. You know, the easiest thing for anyone to do is to stop the spread, whether that's, you know, cleaning off your boots and your pets and your strollers and your bikes at the end of a hike and before you go out as well as any work items that you're using in natural areas. It's stuff that'll keep your car cleaner, which is always a bonus. And it'll also help our environment. And then if you're planting a garden, avoiding planting those invasive ornamental species. And of course, I really recommend that you check out the Go Beyond Beauty portion of our website for lots more information on that. Folks can also spread the word, sharing about how to get involved, or we have some planting guide and different resources, sharing those with their neighbors and friends when they hear, oh, you were going to plant Japanese barberry? What if you didn't? There's some really great alternatives, and ISN has an event where you can bring your barberry and get it exchanged for a coupon because it's a real nasty plant in the environment and even for human health. And then, of course, like I said, getting involved is always a great one, whether it's with us or with any of our partners. We really appreciate that. Emily, before I move on, are there any questions about messaging or anything that you as our outreach specialist would like to share?
No, not yet. We're set on questions. Shelley is sharing a few resources in the chat though about the things you've mentioned. So if you're curious, you can check down there.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. Well, with that, we're going to move into identification and some treatment stuff mixed in as well. So in ISN's top 12, the one we get probably the most traffic about is Japanese knotweed, although really we're talking about them more as invasive knotweeds, plural now. We do have Japanese knotweed, certainly. We also have giant knotweed, which is taller, and also the hybrid between the two, Bohemian knotweed. Or just sometimes folks just call it Bohemian knotweed. Japanese knotweed is illegal in Michigan, not to have, but to sell, trade, or share, or move, even by accident. So if this is something on your property, Please do not move it around. Please do not give it to neighbors, anything like that. It was introduced as an ornamental because, as you can see in this picture, it's a really lovely plant. It has these thick kind of bamboo-like stems. That's one of the common names that gets thrown around is like Mexican bamboo, Michigan bamboo, any of those names. It's not from Mexico, it's not from Michigan. Both species of giant and Japanese knotweed are from a couple of volcanic regions in Japan. Really, really cool plants. The problem is that, as you see in this photo, they're also very, very strong plants. I mentioned that they're from volcanic regions, and so they're able to bust through brickwork and pavement and boat trailer tires, all sorts of stuff. So they cause some pretty big issues with our infrastructure and also with our habitat, blocking access to water by wildlife and taking up space. These plants are allelopathic. They can put out chemicals into the soil that stop other plants from growing. So a lot of times when we work to treat these plants, there's nothing underneath. Some of the key characteristics are this bamboo-like stem is really, really, really clear, especially right after the first frost in early fall. You'll see all the leaves fall off. This is a very frost-sensitive plant. Unfortunately, it doesn't kill it all the way into the ground. But when those leaves fall off, you see these stems standing, and a lot of times they turn a pretty bright red. It has leaves that are variable. They can be pretty flat at the base and then pointy at the tip, or they can have kind of a heart-shaped or cordate base. Leaves are usually at least the size of my hand, and I have a smaller hand. Giant knotweed would have leaves the size of a dinner plate. You can see here, this Japanese knotweed is, probably about 6 feet tall, and that's pretty average. It might be a little shorter than that. Giant knotweed and the hybrid knotweed are often taller, with giant knotweed getting in towards the 12-foot range. They do have these little sprigs of white flowers as well. That's pretty late summer bloom. And what else should I be sharing with you about identification? I would really say that the stems are key to identification, because that is just something that doesn't really look like anything else, except for bamboo. But this plant bamboo isn't technically woody, but it's a lot firmer. This is a hollow stem. So if you cut this open, it's quite hollow and very breakable, which is also a problem because every node where these leaves come off is a place that can start a new plant. It can grow roots and stems and leaves from there and grow a new plant. So mowing is highly not recommended. It makes a big problem if you mow it down and then spread it along the roadside or spread it along your property, or it grows in your compost heap. It's a real bummer of a plant. Next up is Invasive Phragmites. This is the one that got ISN its start. It is a pretty tall grass, as you can see in this photo of my friend Jill. She's not the tallest person ever, but she's not super short either. And so you can see that population, which was in downstate Michigan, was extremely tall. A lot of times we see it closer to the 6 to 8 foot height, but it can be incredibly tall. It is that fluffy tops of the plant. Those are its seed heads, or well, at that point they're flowering when they're purple, and then as they ripen into seeds, they turn a lovely gold color. The leaves come off all along the stem. So if you are just getting the leaves coming up from the base of the plant, that is not Phragmites. It might be another invasive grass, but it's not Phragmites unless, as you can see, all those leaves coming off all along the stems. And it is a slow starter in the spring. It's only just starting to poke up right now. So you won't see it too much now, but later in the year, those big fluffy seed heads are very identifiable. The other issue is that this is another plant that mowing can be a problem because Phragmites can spread by rhizomes. It'll send these shoots out along the bed of water. This is often, this is a plant that grows right on the water's edge, and so you often see it in ditches and lake shores. And so it is able to sprout from all of those little spots, as you can see in that picture there. We do have a native Phragmites as well, and it is extremely difficult to tell the difference. And truly I could like kind of teach a whole class on that. So I'm not going to get into the weeds. But one of the best ways to tell the difference is whether or not the sheaths of these leaves, so that you can see the leaves going out horizontally. And I don't have great pictures of this, which is why there's no pictures. But if the leaf that sticks out has a sheath that goes around the stem, and on the native Phragmites, those come off very easily, and the stem underneath is very, very smooth. On the invasive Phragmites, those sheaths will stick, even if the leaf part comes off, the sheath will stick much harder around the stem. And if you are able to get it off, it feels like an emery board underneath. It's very grooved and kind of scratchy. So that's kind of the best way, but of course these plants can hybridize as well. There's also an increased fire risk with all of these fluffy plants. If someone flicks a cigarette butt into there in late November, you could end up with quite a fire. And so it is a big problem there. Invasive bittersweet, sometimes called oriental bittersweet, is a vine, a woody vine. So you will see the vine year round. It doesn't die back to the ground the way Japanese knotweed does. And it twines around stuff. It doesn't often truly strangle trees. As you can see in this picture, it much more overtops them and outcompetes them. It doesn't tighten the way like a strangler fig or anything like that does. It just does grow around, and this could eventually cause some problems for the tree, but usually it happens so slowly that that's not the problem. It's the just growing all over the place. The main identification for bittersweet, it does have these orbiculate leaves, which is where the Latin orbiculatus comes from. And so that means that they're wider at the base than they are at the tip, but pretty oval shaped overall. They are toothed leaves, but they kind of just look like leaves unless you're a crazy plant person. So a lot of times what folks are looking for when they think about bittersweets is the fruits. They have these very ornamental fruits. You've probably seen them in fall decorations. That's a major use of this plant, is that they are used in fall decorations. But you can actually tell the difference between these plants most clearly by the fruits, because the Asian bittersweet, the invasive bittersweet, has much smaller capsules around the seeds, and also they're borne all along the stem. Whereas the American bittersweet has much larger, like almost twice the size. They don't usually open up as nicely, and they're often borne only at the tips of the branch, or even just the twig itself that's holding the seeds. As you can see, it's all along this little branch versus they're clustered at the tips for the native one. That is the easiest way to tell them apart, is the fruits. There are some different other ways about like exactly what does the leaf look like and how it unfurls, but I even get tripped up in those. They can be pretty tricky. So, and again, these two do hybridize, which makes identification even more difficult. But if you have any questions about like, oh, it kind of looks like it might be a little bit more towards the invasive bittersweet, then it's probably either the invasive or the hybrid, which is really frustrating. Garlic mustard, we've talked about this one a couple of times. This is a plant that has a 2-year life cycle, so it can look really, really different between 2 years. The first year, it looks like this, and you can see I've got like my pen there in the picture. In the fall, after it's sprouted, this is what it will look like. It kind of has almost kidney-shaped or almost full circle leaves with like a wavy, it's called a crenation, but a wavy edge. And then in the second year, it will bolt and grow up tall and have white flowers at the top. And then much more heart-shaped leaves that are a little bit closer to toothing than crenations. Yay, dentate and crenate. Everyone loves all of those fancy plant words. But so they do change a little bit. And when they're teeny tiny seedlings, it's just literally just 2 little flat seed leaves. They are pretty unremarkable. The great thing is that if you pull them before they go to seed, you've prevented a whole other year of plants, because they have several thousand seeds per plant. And so pulling is a great option for this one. and it's not too difficult. They don't have those deep, deep roots like Japanese knotweed has, going 9 feet into the ground. They're not doing the rhizomes like Phragmites does. These are plants that are much easier to target. Another really key identifying feature for garlic mustard is in its name. It smells like kind of a garlicky, oniony smell. And so that can be really great because there's lots of mustards out there and they all kind of like, I don't know, it has 4 petals and like leaves and stuff. And so you're not really sure, but if it smells like garlic, that is a really good option for like, okay, I'm pretty sure this is garlic mustard for sure. And the best time to identify this one is spring. We're running into now, it's getting closer and closer to seeding. And then once it seeds, the whole plant dies. And then it becomes very difficult to even notice because it just like skeletonizes and you really don't see it. So being out in April through June is really the best time to find this plant. Some of its problem is that because it smells like garlic, nothing wants to eat it. And so it is able to really spread. There have been some really interesting studies that have come out in the press lately about leaving garlic mustard alone because pulling it can stir up the seed bank and kind of make it worse, which is really fantastic research and interesting to learn about. But unfortunately, a lot of it doesn't take into account the pressures of when deer or other herbivores won't eat garlic mustard and they eat everything else. It doesn't give the native ecosystem a chance to recover and crowd the garlic mustard back out. So since we have deer, it's still really important for us to be pulling garlic mustard. We have 2 species of buckthorns, the common buckthorn, which is this one here, and the glossy buckthorn here. They look kind of similar and kind of different. They're both shrubs. Common buckthorn in particular has a great way to identify it of this really orange underbark. You can see the gray bark and the white in the middle, but then right under the bark, the gray part of the bark is really bright orange, and that's a great way to identify it. Glossy buckthorn is a little more yellow, can be a little bit more difficult to identify, but that is a really key identifier for sure. Something else that's really interesting about both of these species is that they are, I'm going to get more botany terms here for you, subalternate. And so sometimes the twig buds or leaves or branching will appear to be opposite, where both of the buds are at the same place or nearly on the twig, and then other places they'll be very different. And so that's something that if you're getting up close and personal with a shrub, you might notice that, like, why is it like this sometimes and then like this other times, like what's going on? That can be a good indicator. Another great indicator is how many berries it has. Particularly the common buckthorn produces squigillions of berries every year, and they are very dark. They stain the sidewalks if they're over a sidewalk. Birds will eat them, but you will also often see bird excrement very near afterwards. They are a very good spreader of both of these species. You can see that the common buckthorn has a little bit more leathery type of leaves, and their veins in the leaves come from pretty far down. They do come up off this midrib, but they come from pretty far down. Whereas the glossy buckthorn, the name comes from the shiny berries, but I mean, there's shiny berries here too, but it has thinner, more papery leaves. These are pretty thick, they're leathery. And the glossy buckthorn has very thin leaves, and that veination is very pronounced. Like, you will really notice that vein depresses into this very thin leaf, so you'll definitely see it. Both of these species cause pretty incredible harm to habitats, including emitting an allelopathic toxin, so putting out a chemical into the soil, and one of them in particular, imodin, is very harmful to frogs in particular as they reproduce, causing birth defects and even non-hatching little tadpoles, which is the saddest thing I can think of because I love frogs. And so they're a really big deal in wetlands, and you do often see them in wetlands. Invasive honeysuckles, there is a very long list of invasive honeysuckles, and particularly in the shrubs. There's Max honeysuckle and Tatarian honeysuckle, and I just forgot all of the rest of them. But there are at least 5 species that we deal with up here. And the great news is that it doesn't really matter if you can identify them, because they're all invasive. We do have some native bush honeysuckles as well. including some that aren't in the Lonicera genus, like the northern bush honeysuckle is in Deer Villa. But the key component to identifying invasive versus native is whether or not they have these hollow stems. And it actually can be a little easier to tell on slightly smaller stems than it is on the big stems, just because on the big stems, oftentimes by the time you cut through them, they're kind of crushed anyway. And so if you can get these slightly smaller stems, you can really see that there is a hole through the stem, and it is chambered, but there is a hole there. Another thing is how the berries are born. In our invasive honeysuckles, they're almost always born on top of the branch, and with our native ones, they often hang below. We also have vining honeysuckles that are both native and invasive. And the great thing about the native ones is that they bear their fruits at the end of the stem in a cup of leaves. So both their flowers and their fruits are in the cup, and I'm sorry, I don't have a photo of that for you. So if you see a vine and there's flowers all along it, similar to on this shrub, that is the Japanese vine honeysuckle. And if you see those flowers in a cup, that's one of our native ones. We have 2 or 3 different species of native vining honeysuckles. So, but the hollow pith is really, really crucial. Japanese barberry is one that we work with a lot at ISN, in particular because it is a very popular landscape plant. Like, if you haven't seen that plant at your local shopping mall or somewhere like outside of the AutoZone or whatever, like I beg you to look again, because it is nearly ubiquitous. It's very, very popular because deer won't eat it. And it comes in amazing colors, and it is really good at growing in lots of places. Unfortunately, kind of all of those reasons make it really good at invading. The deer don't eat it, and so it is able to get into a situation like this where it's the entire understory of a forest. And we're seeing the beginnings of that here in some areas, but when we go out east, we see it even worse. That's what this photo is from, I believe, Connecticut. So it's a big thing that we don't want. In particular, you know, of course, crowding out our native species is always a bummer. But the shrub changes the pH of the soil to make it more difficult for other plants to grow. And it also has been found to support the black-legged tick. And the black-legged tick is the tick that carries Lyme disease, which is a pretty big human health risk. And areas with no Japanese barberry have these black-legged ticks at a rate of something like 5 or 10 per acre, more or less. And then in areas like this where it's nothing but Japanese barberry, it was over 120 ticks per acre. And so that's a lot more ticks. That's a lot more risk for Lyme disease. And I don't want Lyme disease. I don't want you to have Lyme disease. So there's my spiel, sorry, about Japanese barberry and how bad it is. But for identifying it, you can see a lot of times it is burgundy, especially in cultivation, but it can escape and turn unburgundy and go back to green, or be like green with a little burgundy line around it. Any of those things are an option. And so it's important not just to look for the burgundy. You can see here those green leaves. These are a spatulate leaf. So you can see it's pretty oval, but that oval connects down on the petiole to the stem. And so it looks like a little spoon-shaped leaves. It has these little red berries that kind of look like Christmas lights dangling down, similar to these cute little flowers, honestly. Like, those are really adorable. Bell-shaped, hanging down below the branch. And so those berries in particular are very noticeable throughout much of the summer and into the fall. You'll also notice that it has spines at every node. And you will definitely notice those if you try to pull it out. Pulling out is a great way to kill this plant if you take it out by the roots, especially if you find a small one. It's very effective, but you have to beware of those spines. So I would say that those spoon-shaped leaves, the red berries, and those spines are some of the biggest identifiers for this shrub. It comes in all sorts of sizes as well, particularly in landscapes. Baby's breath is a really big deal for our dunes. It can really take over, as you see in this picture. Everything gray, kind of gray-blue in this picture, which is like kind of most of it, is baby's breath. And in our dunes, we're trying to allow for movement of sand and all the really cool species that are evolved for being in the dunes. This is the same species of plant as what's in like with your roses in your bouquets and stuff. And so we're asking folks to throw those in the trash and not the compost. But looking for those big kind of tumbleweed shapes. It's a big mound shaped plant. Here's what it looks like a little bit earlier in the year. Pretty nondescript. You might recognize the leaves. It looks a little bit carnation-y to me. Like if you think about the leaves that come on the carnations in the bouquets, it's very similar there. And then as it gets older, it'll poof out more and do that white bloom. It does have a sweet smell that I find pretty gaggy, and I think a lot of folks do, but some people do enjoy it. So if you're finding a sweet smell, that could be a way to identify it. They're still looking like this or even a little smaller right now. Once we get in towards July, you'll see them turning into their big tumbleweed status. These are one that's really important to dig all the way down to get their roots, or at least to get the root collar, the caudex. Lyme grass or blue lime grass is another ornamental plant. You can see here it is growing in an ornamental setting. It was in a nice little like row, but again, it really causes a lot of damage in our dune systems. And one of the difficult things, you can kind of see it in this picture, is that blue lime grass is kind of this bright whitish powdery blue. And our other grasses like our dune grass and our beach grass can be a little bit glaucous, a little bit whitish. But they're not going to be as blue. And you can see it again in this picture. Here is the blue lime grass, and everywhere else is the beach grass. It is pretty remarkable once you see it, but it can be very difficult when you haven't seen it. It has these pretty tight culms, the seed heads there that aren't particularly showy, so you wouldn't probably notice them that much. It's much more about this blue color that you would really see. And again, it's a big trouble in our dunes in particular. Purple loosestrife, this is another illegal to sell, trade, share plant, accidentally move. It's one of our few ornamental species that are actually regulated. While it's growing, it looks pretty unremarkable. It does have square stems. It's in the mint family, and its leaves are opposite, and you'll see that it's all opposite there all the time, but it just kind of looks like plants. You may not notice it, but then in late July, and I would say mid to late July and into early August, you get these brilliant purple flowers up at the top. And so you'll see this is a wetland plant. You will see it in ditches. You'll see it on lake shores and in swamps. And that is what you will notice the purple. It is pretty hard to miss because it is quite a purple flower. Yeah, the mint, I would say the mint, the square stems, you will be able to feel the four edges on the stem and those purple flowers. Unfortunately, I should have had more pictures, always should have had more pictures. But you see that the flowers come up from the top of the stem. We do have some native loosestrifes that have a more arching form, and their flowers are all along the stem. There are other plants like verbenas and vervain that also have a purple flower, but it's more of a blue purple, less of this bright magenta. I would say that this picture is pretty good at showing that color. And so if you see more of a blue color. Yeah. Emily, did you have a question to share or anything?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. No questions, just Shelly's continuing to be kind of the link queen. So if you're looking for any additional information, just keep checking that chat because she's throwing in links to like the different species to get more details on. Awesome, thank you so much. Yeah, so this is just a big one in wet areas for sure. You'll see it in ditches during drive-bys, 100%. Callery pear, or it's sometimes sold as Bradford pear, is a new one on our top 12 list. It is very commonly planted. If you go down to downtown Traverse City or downtown East Lansing, it is an extremely common street tree. Because of these beautiful showy flowers in the spring, I think that Traverse City probably planted them to be like, ooh, cherry blossoms, even though it's not a cherry, but they do bloom at a similar time, and they're very beautiful.
But a great way to distinguish them from cherries is that cherry blossoms smell sweet, and these do not. If you would like to have a laugh, get on the internet and search what they smell like, and you'll find all sorts of very graphic descriptions of how bad they smell, but they do not smell pleasant. I will leave it there. The other thing that folks often discount Callery pear is because they see that name pear and assume like it would be like an Anjou pear or one of the big pears that you can buy at the grocery store. And no, here are the full grown pears. They're like the size of the end of my thumb. They're not very big. They're quite round. They're kind of speckled. Like once you look at them kind of closely with those speckles in there, you might notice, oh, that is kind of like what pear skin looks like. Especially if you've had like, I've always heard them called Asian pear, but they're like apple pears. They have a similar skin to that, but they're very small and they're very hard. They're not squishy. And so folks like that, because it's not too messy on those street trees. But unfortunately, the birds will carry them away, and we're seeing really big issues, less so in Michigan at the moment, although we are certainly seeing spread, but particularly in Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin, they see a lot of spread. None of these trees were planted, and they are moving into a lot of areas. So this is a great one to keep an eye out for. In the spring, the leaves are small and simple and just very breakable, if you will, very delicate. Later in summer, and especially once they're starting to get their fruits, those leaves are very leathery. They're heart-shaped. You can see it kind of comes in there at the base of the petiole, and they come to a point, and they are very thick and leathery. And so that is a great way to identify them as well. This plant doesn't form true thorns, but a lot of times if it aborts a twig, it will form into a sharp point. And so we've had some fun when we have been treating these getting stabbed. So be careful. Not a true thorn, but there are sharp ends in places. Another new addition to our top 12 is the tree of heaven. This is a really cool and culturally important tree in China, from what I understand from a couple of my friends. It is the tallest tree, or one of the tallest trees, and that's reflected in its Latin name, meaning tallest. It's very, very, very fast growing and a super cool tree. Unfortunately, it is also stinky. If you scrape some bark, you might be reminded of rancid peanut butter, which was described to me, and I was like, oh, okay. And then I smelled it, and I was like, oh, that does smell like rotten peanut butter. So keep that in mind. And it does grow extremely quickly. That's honestly one of the best identifiers of it. Here it is in kind of a shrubby form. And then it will grow up into a very tall, very thick tree very quickly. So if you look somewhere one year and think, oh, look at that little sumac, that would be something that you might confuse it with those compound leaves. And then the next year it's like kind of a tree. And then the year after that, it's kind of a big tree. That could be tree of heaven for sure. Also, unlike sumacs or black walnuts, they have these papery fruits with little seeds inside that can fly around and spread. I also honestly find a lot of ID from how jagged this stem is. You can kind of see it in this picture. It's like bonk, 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 bonk. That's a big part of the identification. It also has these really large leaf scars. I don't spend a lot of time talking about leaf scars with most people when we're identifying stuff, but this one is really big ones. And so you can see that it does have a brown pith that's kind of spongy, whereas some of the other lookalikes have either a chambered pith or a solid pith. And so that can be important to take a look at. And then the other thing is these leaflets are smooth. Most of our pinnately compound leaflet trees in the region are serrated, like our sumacs and like our black walnuts. This one's smooth, and it does have these two glands at the base of most of these leaves. So you can look for those as well. Again, you know, the peanut butter, the fast growth, the pseudosamaras are all really good identifiers. But if you're really not sure, remember those smooth leaflets and those little glands can be really important. And just the twigs are really chunky. They're big, hefty sort of plants very, very quickly. And unfortunately, that also means that they're quite brittle and easy to break. So if it's near your house, it could be a problem. Another reason that this species, besides all these problems and the fact that it is allelopathic and stops other plants from growing and blah, 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 this is also on our top 12 list because it's a big part of the spotted lanternfly spread. Spotted lanternfly is another invasive species. It is an insect. And it doesn't require a tree of heaven, but it sure does love it to complete its life cycle. And so it has been found that in areas with tree of heaven, the spotted lanternfly is able to reproduce much more quickly. It's not required, but it is a big part of it. So any areas that we can take it out, especially for all the other reasons, but it's just kind of an added incentive. Okay. So that was 12 plants, kind of a little more. I snuck in a couple there with our multiple honeysuckles and buckthorns, but that was our top 12. But there's a lot more than that. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, I'm going to swoop in. I just tried to catch you before, but I just am having a hard time unmuting myself today. We did have a quick question before you move on. It's what type of natural habitats are you seeing Callery pear invade?
Callery pear, it's a really good question. Callery pear is oftentimes a little bit of an edgelord. You'll see it on the edge of forests, in fallow fields. They're seeing it a lot truly in Illinois and Wisconsin along roadsides. You can see this picture in an area where there is a healthy forest here, and then the Callery pear are expanding from there. So that could be a threat to some of our game species, especially game birds like those edge habitats. And if this Callery pear is taking that over and not supporting insects for our woodcock and grouse to eat, that could be a big problem. But we're often seeing them in forest edges, or even just like kind of disturbed forests, or fallow fields. Great question.
And one other, there was a comment a couple back from downstate just mentioning that it was all along the roadways, like in Grand Rapids and that sort, which kind of supports that. And I had followed up saying that it is, and you had kind of mentioned this, but it's worse in other areas at this point. We're not seeing it spread quite as much in northern Michigan yet.
But we have unfortunately seen it. We do have it along all our downtown roads in Traverse City, and then we have found it reproducing quite happily at the Commons Natural Area in Traverse City. So it is definitely moving around there. We aren't at this stage yet, but it's definitely happening. So
cool. Thank you for clarifying.
Yeah, absolutely. And with the changing climate and just seeing our neighbors struggling with it makes us very aware of it as a struggle as well. And so I didn't really talk much about tree of heaven habitat either. It often grows wherever it can. It might bust up through some sidewalk in a back alleyway that doesn't see a lot of traffic. I see it a lot on roadsides, actually. If you're in our region and you're taking M72 out of Traverse City towards Kalkaska, along the bay there's a bunch of it like blap, blap, blap. I've seen it on Garfield Road. You see it on a lot of roadsides, just kind of areas that might not receive quite as much care, but we'll also see it again on those forest edges and fallow fields next to houses. It was brought here because it's a really cool tree. And so you might see it next to houses, especially on farmsteads. But it's spreading very rapidly into urban areas as well. So, you could see it kind of there's nowhere that I would be like, oh, it wouldn't grow there. I found it at Bayshore Park in Traverse City. So it's a little bit everywhere. Okay, so now moving into more species. We talked about European frogbit. This is one that is confirmed in the Eastern UP and some parts of the Lower Peninsula as well. I think mostly the Eastern Lower Peninsula, but I think it might also be in the Grand Rapids area. The more you look for something, the more you find it. The best way to identify European frogbit is those cute little lily pads are really only about the size of a silver dollar. And then they do have these nice white 3-petaled flowers that are, oh, this is so cute. I want to murder it, obviously, but it is an adorable plant. And it grows very thickly, as you can see in this photo, and will overtop a pond or slow moving water area very quickly. Those silver dollar size lily pads that don't get bigger, some of our native lily pads might start out little, but then they get big. These start out little and stay little. They don't get bigger. The only other one that you might confuse it with would be water shield, which is a native plant that is about the same size, but water shield is very oval and like wider in the middle and narrow at the tips. And it doesn't have this dimple the way that frogbit does. That's more of a lily pad shape. and Water Shield does not have that. So looking for it being kind of a circle, being pretty small, having that dimple is a great way to identify it. Kudzu is often termed the plant that ate the South, and that's where we're getting this picture from, of just overtopping everything all the time, causing erosion. It was planted to stop erosion. Oh boy, did it not work. Best ways to identify it, it looks like a bean. If you've ever grown beans, like pole beans or bush beans in your garden, those 3-part compound leaves are really like clear. We don't have a lot of other plants that have that, other than like poison ivy, I guess. But this doesn't look like poison ivy. Poison ivy is often glossier, and certainly would never have a pretty purple flower or a bean. Poison ivy has white berries, or drupes technically. But that is a big thing to look for. Yeah, again, you could confuse it with poison ivy, but it's a little bit hairy. Poison ivy is not hairy. Poison ivy is very, very smooth. So those would be some of the big things to look for. We do have one confirmed population of this in Benzie County. We've been working on it for years. It's like mostly dead and just won't really give up the ghosts. It hasn't been reported in most areas until we get down into southwest Michigan. There are some populations down there that they're really struggling with, because luckily for us, I think our cold winters kept our population pretty small. But it was a little warmer down there, and it seems like it did pretty okay. So they've been working on that, and it's always a good one to keep your eye open for. Giant hogweed is another one we get lots and lots of calls about, because the news will share this because it's a big health hazard. This is, as you can see by this dude in a hazmat suit, a plant that can give you chemical burns from brushing up against it, or certainly if you broke it and got the sap on you. They're not very fun burns, and I'm sure many of us have seen the news articles with people with big, horrible blisters all up their leg or on their chest or their face. And there's actually been some children that died. So it's not a great plant to have close to you. But we do have a native species, the cow parsnip, that looks extremely similar, and it can be very difficult to tell. You know, in these two pictures, like, oh, well, that one's real spiky and that one's real not spiky. And like, yes, that is true, but if this plant had been, this is more of a sun leaf. If it had been more shady, it might have looked a little closer. So the biggest way to tell the difference between giant hogweed and cow parsnip is scale. Cow parsnip is usually, I'm 5'8". Even the bloom of cow parsnip might be just over my head. It is a big plant. You can notice it. It's in a lot of ditches or wetter areas, often in part shade or even full shade. But it's usually about as tall as me, and that's the native cow parsnip. Pretty big plant. Giant hogweed, as you see, is taller than these adult men, who are at least as tall as me, I would assume. I have not met them. They live in British Columbia. But it is a huge plant. So this cow parsnip leaf is about the size of a dinner plate, and these giant hogweed leaves are the size of hubcaps or wheels, you know, or the whole wheel and tire of a car. They're much larger. Similar thing with the flowers. They have, you can kind of see it here. They have like a Queen Anne's lace looking flower, and the ones for cow parsnip would be pretty big, maybe like a large saucer or a small plate, and the ones for giant hogweed are going to be really large. So just that scale. There are some other areas of like, giant hogweed tends to have more purple stems and cow parsnip tends to have more green stems, and that's absolutely true. There tend to be more of these little prickly trichomes on the hogweed versus on the cow parsnip, and yes, but it's all kind of like, it's just kind of more. And so just thinking about how massive is this plant is a big part of it. Another thing is, cow parsnip actually does have some of the same phytotoxic chemicals because they're closely related. They're in the same genus, but it has very little, and you'd have to break the stem and like rub it on you and shut it into the sun to get a burn. So if you brushed up against the plant and didn't get a burn, it's probably cow parsnip. Whereas these guys are in hazmat suits for a reason. It's a plant that can get you when you brush by it, much more like poison ivy in that regard. So just thinking about how massive it is. Flowering rush is another really beautiful invasive species. Again, planted for ornamental purposes and now regulated and no longer allowed to be sold. It is confirmed in the Saginaw Bay area, and I've seen it in Southeast Michigan. I haven't seen it in our region yet, so that's great. It can look a lot like a lot of different plants. It does have triangle diameter leaves, like if you cut the leaf, it'll look like a triangle. And so that can be useful. There are a couple of other plants that have that, but that could be a good way to tell that it's flowering rush. But the best way is honestly to catch it flowering, which usually happens in July. Because there's nothing else that flowers like this, with these kind of pinky white petals with a darker pink in the middle and this cluster in what otherwise looks kind of like grass or whatever. It's not very tall, maybe like knee high on knee, maybe a little bit taller than that in like just the right conditions, but it's not a very tall plant. So just keeping your eye open for that one. Coltsfoot is a species that most of the state, I would say, isn't as concerned about. But here in Northwest Michigan, we are, because it is growing in, or has been growing in profusion on Glen Lake, which is an area that we have some very special plants. The Michigan monkey flower only grows in 4 counties in Michigan, and Glen Lake is one of the places that it grows, and the coltsfoot is trying to outcompete it. And so we're very concerned about that. Other areas may be less concerned, but coltsfoot grows a lot in seeps and springs and wet areas, which is also where the Michigan monkey flower grows. In early spring, like late April, early May, you get these dandelion-like flowers where they have like the fringe at the edge, but then they are a little tighter in the middle. And as you can see, there's no leaves yet, or very few leaves poking up. So it's important to look for that in that early spring. Later on in the year, those flowers disappear. They end up looking like dandelions. So if you see a dandelion with this kind of kidney or horseshoe shaped leaf that's green on top and white, very white on the bottom, that could be our coltsfoot. And you can see here, there's actually some little babies in the background. So they aren't always quite so large leaves. Those leaves are about this big. So what is that, like 4 inches across, maybe 6 at the max. But they do come in smaller sizes, but that white underneath is a great way to identify them. Or those early dandelions without dandelion leaves, very early. Another one that grows along seeps and streams and waters edges is butterbur, which is Petasites japonicus or Petasites hybridus. There are 2 different species. It doesn't matter which one it is. Again, I mean, you should try, but they're identified very similarly. You can see it has very large leaves. They kind of look like rhubarb leaves of just like giant leaf situation growing out of an entire ditch. Usually you'll see, especially if it is in an area near cultivation where someone may have planted it in their landscape. This is one, again, we have on the streams leading into Glen Lake. It is very big. It crowds out everything else. In the early spring, it has these little tight kind of cone-shaped flowers that then get bigger and have fluffy tops later on. Even this was in early May, so these flowers must be in late April, very early. They have some big problems with this up in the UP, in particular in the Marquette area, and then we have it on Glen Lake. There are probably other areas of the state as well, but it's a great one to keep an eye out for, because if you catch it early, as always, if you catch it early, it's so much easier. Swallowworts are distributed a little bit throughout the state. There's some in Southeast Michigan, there's some in Southwest Michigan. We have a population in Kingsley, and there's some in the area to the north of us as well. There are 2 different species, black swallowwort, which is the one that I think we have the most of. I don't know that we have pale swallowwort in Michigan. And the main way to tell them apart is just to see them flowering. As you can see here, they're really good at overtopping. And the interesting thing about these guys, habitat-wise, is that this is a species that looks enough like milkweed that the monarchs are tricked into laying their eggs on these leaves. And then when the eggs hatch into caterpillars, it's not a milkweed, and so they can't eat it. And those little caterpillars die, which is like the saddest. But they do even have these milkweed type pods with the fluffy fluffies inside. But they are a twining vine. And the reason I put this picture in is not only so you can see this twining vine, but I want you to see that this little black flower is actually this little black flower right by my ring finger there. It's tiny. They're like about the size of the end of an eraser, perhaps. They're quite small. So don't think that you're going to go out and see these, like you can see them, absolutely. But I emphasize this because I always assumed looking at these, that these little clusters of flowers would be like kind of big and I'd be able to see them quite easily. And then when I saw it for the first time in person, I was like, oh, that's so tiny. So tiny. Once you know what you're looking for, you can absolutely see it. But I do want to emphasize that they are quite small. Another twining vine that we're having trouble with in Michigan is Chinese yam. Again, this is one found in the Grand Rapids area, but we do have one population in Grand Traverse County that we did treat last year. So we'll see how it goes from here. One of the most significant things about identification is this leaf shape. We have some other leaves that can look a little similar, especially things like bindweed, but they don't usually have these big, I would call them hips. Usually it's a little bit more just heart-shaped. And so for that big hump there, that's very particular. Also, when I saw these in person for the first time, I noticed the leaves have a very dark edge. It looks like someone took a felt tip pen and outlined this leaf. So that is a really clear way, for me at least, that I was like, oh, I've never seen that on a plant before. It also apparently has a cinnamon sort of smell. I haven't smelled that before, but I believe folks that say it. They may also form these little air potatoes, which is really, again, very cute. But they don't often do that here in Michigan. From what we have been able to tell from the populations here in Michigan, they often don't form the air potatoes. And so you're looking more for these leaves and the vine that entangles stuff. Himalayan balsam is a really cool and beautiful plant, again, found in the eastern UP and in West Michigan as well. We're watching out for it here. If you are familiar with jewelweed, these are closely related, and you will notice some similarities, particularly in the flower shape, except these are pink and they're also huge. You know, jewelweed, when you get a really big, robust patch, it might be like maybe 4.5 feet tall. And Himalayan balsam is often like 6 or more feet tall. It's very, very large, and the flowers are pretty beefy as well. It also has these serrated leaves. Our native jewelweed has smooth entire leaves, and so you can notice that for sure. You usually see Himalayan balsam in kind of wettish and disturbed areas. So I've seen it on ditches and just kind of like at the edge of a parking lot where it was wet, those kinds of areas. It can be certainly very sandy as well, but most often I've seen them in more wet areas. Mile a minute weed was just found in Lower Michigan last year for the first time. We've never had it in Michigan before. This is another one that can cause some like startles because again, things like bindweed may look a little similar, especially at first glance, but mile a minute weed has these very triangular leaves. And it's also sometimes called tear thumb because you can see that the petiole has these little stabbities on it, little prickles that are apparently quite sharp. I haven't seen this one in person, so I can't tell you how sharp they are, but I believe that they are sharp. And then the other thing is that many of those other vining species don't get these bright blueberries. So being able to recognize that is key. But looking for that clear triangle and those serrated sort of petioles is key. So Emily, any other questions before we take a break?
Nope, we are good to take a break.
All right, so with that, I would love to give us just a quick, really quick 2-minute break to stand up, wiggle, and get some more water. And I'll see you in just a minute or two. All right. Let's see. I think I am back. Emily, are you back too?
Yep, I'm here.
All right, awesome. Well, I'm gonna keep on keeping on then. We have more species to go. Yay! And then I'll give you a break and then I'll give you more species again. So it's gonna be great, I promise. So we've gone through our top 12, which are the species that ISN is doing the most action on, and also our early detection species, which ISN is also doing a lot of action on, particularly with that swallowwort that we have a population of the one hogweed. Oh, I forgot to share that the hogweed that we have in Manistee County may be eradicated. Last year when we went back, we didn't see any, which is great. We're going to go back and monitor again this year. But right now we're feeling really good about it as a success story. Yeah, so we are working with some of those early detection species, but a lot of times we're just on lookout for them because we know that there are other places. So these awareness species, as I mentioned before, these are species that we want people to be aware of. We know that they're invasive, we know that they're causing problems, but a lot of times with ISN's restricted grant funding, we can't tackle everything. And so these may be species that there's a lot of already, or that we are encouraging landowners to manage on their own property. And so the prime example of that is autumn olive and also the Russian olive, but mostly autumn olive in our region. This is that species that was encouraged for planting by conservation organizations and is now practically ubiquitous in our landscape. You see it in fallow fields, you see it on forests, disturbed forests and forest edges, even into wetlands. It'll grow anywhere that it can. Some great ways to identify autumn olive is that every part of this shrub is covered in little scales. And so on the tops of the leaves, you might not see it too much unless you look really close, but on the undersides, you can see it's very silvery. The whole shrub ends up with a little bit of a silvery look to it. The bark, even on the twigs, ends up being a little bit bronzy. And even on these little berries that come out in the fall, they have little shiny scales on them. The flowers even are silvery. So you can definitely see those scales, and that can be a great way to identify it. Also, the bright red berries in fall. Right now, autumn olive is blooming here in the Grand Traverse region in Northwest Michigan. You can smell it when you drive by. It honestly smells really nice. It's a sweet smell. So if you're driving somewhere and you're like, oh, what is that lovely fragrance? It might be olive. Bummer. It's a problem because it is so good at growing. It doesn't support any of those insects, and it is able to grow both by its seeds, and it can also spread through root suckers. So it's a real bummer. It also has a relative, the Russian olive, which is pretty similar, except it's more tree-like. And as you can see in this picture, it's even more silvery and is actually even a little bit fuzzy. The leaves are a little longer, more like a true olive. This is not an olive, despite being called olive, but those leaves are more like an olive tree, whereas the autumn olive is more of a lancelet, oval sort of situation and not quite so long. But yeah, autumn olive, I truly also, you could ask like any farmer to point to the autumn or Russian olive. They may call, a lot of folks call autumn olive Russian olive. For whatever reason, that name seems to have stuck harder with folks. And so, you know, whatever. But if you ask like kind of any farmer, they'll be like, oh yeah, we got some of that out back. So folks know what it looks like for sure. Multiflora rose is one that arrived through cultivation for folks planting them in their gardens, but no one's planting these now. They're just a little bit not gorgeous enough, I think, perhaps for our gardens nowadays. They are a rose, so they have rose flowers, but they're kind of the old style of rose where they don't have multiple petals usually, just those 5 petals. They're almost always white. They're always in a cluster like that, which can be a great way to tell them apart, because a lot of the other roses are born more singly, or like maybe a cluster, but not these are like a cluster at the end of a stem. They do have these little hips that are in fall, born in these clusters again, just like the flowers, but they're quite small. You know, a lot of our garden roses have very large, showy rose tips as their fruits. And these little hips are like the size of my pinky fingernail, which you basically can't see, but like not very large little fruits. They are edible and a great source of vitamin C, and unfortunately the birds will spread them as well. It has an arching form, and of course it has thorns on it, and these compound leaves. And if you follow the compound leaf to the base where it attaches to the stem, you'll see this thing called a stipule, this little cape at the base here. And all roses have a stipule, which is that little cape, and it may be just some wings, it may be this sweet thing with the tail here. But the thing that multiflora rose does that other roses don't is that it is fringed. So these little fringes coming off the stipule are the key indicator for multiflora rose. You know, I can a lot of times tell multiflora rose, especially when it's in flower, without getting that close to it, because you just kind of get the feel for it. But if you're just starting out and you look for that multiflora rose fringe stipule, that is the clearest way to identify it. Because we do have some native roses, and we have lots of roses that aren't invasive. There's one other invasive rose, but it's not very common, so we don't talk about it too much. But this one is pretty common because it was planted on a lot of farmsteads. You'll see it a lot of times in disturbed fields or like fallow fields and forest edges, but may even find it in deep forest, especially if there's like one tree fell. Like this plant will really fill in, and it can be a big problem for wildlife passage or human passage, as I found out many times. Dame's rocket is a species that shows up in a lot of wildflower seed mixes. So touted as something that you're doing for the environment when in fact it's a problem. It is really lovely. Purple or white flowers are very common. Sometimes it even moves towards pink. But you can see it has these more lance-shaped flowers or leaves, excuse me, that start off as a rosette. This is actually a relative of the garlic mustard, so they do the same thing where the first year it's a rosette, very different leaves, obviously. And then in subsequent year, it will grow up and have those flowers, and then it will die, and its seeds will go all over the place, and then you'll have more Dame's rocket. The difference here that's really important is that Dame's rocket has 4 petals, and phlox, there are native phlox, there are non-native phlox that are used in a lot of gardens. Phlox have 5 petals, and Dame's rocket has 4 because it's in the mustard family. So that is a really key distinction. Phlox are also usually perennial, whereas these Dame's rocket are the biennial, where they have the 2-year life cycle of the rosette and the adult. And you can see here that they're quite good at spreading, especially in forested areas. And then that's a lot of pulling to do. And in the meantime, you've lost, again, all of those trillium and violets and beautiful spring species. So if you were considering using a wildflower packet with Dame's rocket, please don't. I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but there you have it. So the really key thing are those 5 petals, or 5 petals for not Dame's rocket. I'm sorry, 5 petals for phlox, 4 petals for Dame's rocket.
Katie, before we move on, we had a comment. Could you speak more to Dame's rocket and I guess along the same line, garlic mustard regrowing from roots that would have appeared to dry out?
Yeah, so garlic mustard in particular has a not very deep but kind of J-shaped root, which can make it difficult to pull. And if you leave enough of the root there, particularly the part right between where the root turns into a stem, the root collar there, if you leave that, it could grow again, and there may even be enough energy in the root to flower in that same year. So it is really important as you're pulling these species to get the whole thing. Dame's rocket doesn't have that J-shaped root. It's a little bit easier to get the whole thing. That said, it's not a situation where that root collar is really way far down. It's just easy to snap them off at that place. And so if you're using like asparagus knife or asparagus fork or a weeding fork that kind of lets you go down and pry them up, and you leave a little bit of the root in there, that's fine. It's much more if you leave that root collar, which is right at the top, then it could flower again, and it would be a bummer. Did that answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Next up is leafy spurge. This one's really, really common on roadsides because it's great at spreading by rhizomes and seeds. And so mowing at the right time can help at least suppress the seed production, but mowing at the wrong time can help spread it. And that's a big bummer because it really does take over on roadsides. Its sap as well can be irritating to humans. And so again, not a situation where, oh, I walked through some leafy spurge and now I have a huge rash. No, but if you're weed whacking it and get it on you, you might have some irritation. Some of the best ways to identify leafy spurge are its very large leaves, which sounds hilarious, but if you know other spurges, you know that oftentimes their leaves are like little sticks. And so the fact that this one has some leaf on it makes it very leafy indeed. It also has umbellate flowers. So that means that they kind of look like an umbrella, and you can see that they're flat, kind of open, pretty yellow, and then also in somewhat of a flat way on the plant itself. And it's often more obvious when you see them in a population. But looking for those slim leaves, a kind of a milky sap, and yellow flowers, particularly, those usually start up in July. You will see them. And if you are planning to mow them, mowing them right as they're flowering before they have a chance to go to seed can be great. You know, it might still make those rhizomes grow. Pulling is really difficult with this species because those rhizomes just let it go and go and go. But at least you wouldn't be spreading it by seed. So that's good. Narrow leaf cattail is a big old bummer in our wetlands, as you may have guessed. And we also have some really fantastic native cattails. And so I'm sure we all know what cattails look like. So I'm going to focus on how to tell the difference. Narrow leaf cattail has a gap between the female part, which is the corn dog, don't put mustard on it, and the male part, which is the pollen up here. So you can kind of see in this picture, there's this pollen that is mostly gone, and then there's a gap of green, and then you turn into the corn dog part, the female flower. That gap is what tells you it is invasive. You can see it a little bit in this picture as well. Narrowleaf cattail is also smaller, slimmer. So you can see that the native cattail is much larger, and then there's no gap until you get to the part where the male flower was, which does disintegrate because it's made of pollen. Whereas with this one, again, you can see the female flower and then a gap of green and then brown. That gets a little harder to tell later in the year, like October. But especially earlier in the year, you can really tell that it's green there. Another way to tell is by the width of the leaf. The narrow leaf cattail is narrow. And so for me, the narrow leaf cattail is usually about the width of my pinky finger, quite narrow. And the native cattail is usually the width of my thumb or more. And you can even see in this photo, it looks like the narrow leaf cattail is about half the width of the native cattail. So looking for that gap in the flowers and the narrower leaves is really key. They can hybridize, of course. So you could find some kind of middle characters. Sometimes it's this big gap, sometimes it's a little gap, but if there's a gap, it's naughty. So look out for that one. Reed canary grass is actually really commonly used as forage for cattle in some areas, but is also sold as ribbon grass in some garden stores. And so the variety that we see most sold ornamentally is this lovely variegated variety, but the variety that's used for forage is usually the regular one. It looks like a grass. It grows in wetter areas, especially wetlands, sedge meadows, any of those kinds of habitats. We see it on river bottoms, we see it in stream floodplains, anything like that. That's a lot of the time where you see it. Not that it couldn't grow other places, but that is where we see the majority of it. In early to midsummer, its flowers are open and they have this really distinct kind of Christmas tree shape, which strikes me in the face a lot of times. The grass itself is maybe knee-high, maybe thigh-high, but then those seed heads come up quite tall. So usually about my height, 5'8", or more or less. But then later in the year, those flowers then kind of close up into that seed head again, and it looks much tighter, maybe a little closer to like a Timothy Hay kind of seed head, if you're familiar with that, or just you can see it's closed in, it's no longer that Christmas tree shape. So watching for it. It also, I don't have a picture of this, and I'm so sorry. It has a ligule, which is right where the leaf attaches to the stem. There's this little papery protuberance, and it's really long on reed canary grass. And so that can be a great way to identify it, of just like, what's all of this extra crud where the leaf comes off? That can be a really good identifier from this species for some others. We also have several species of invasive thistles, and we have some native species of thistles. So what I've done here is put up part of a pamphlet. The Wild Rivers Invasive Species Coalition, another SISMA, made a really fantastic pamphlet that would do a much better job than me explaining it to you. Honestly, like the take home is stabby thistles mean not stabby thistles native. There's more to it than that, but most often our stabbier thistles are the invasive ones. And don't be fooled by the name Canada thistle. It's not from Canada. It's also invasive. And so I really recommend, and hopefully Shelley can drop this in the chat as well. It is on our website under resources, I think, and maybe also under the thistle page. But this is just a fantastic resource. So rather than me trying to shove more down your brains, I would just say, check this out. It's amazing. Stabby good, or stabby bad, I'm sorry. Less stabby good. I'll say the opposite thing 3 times just to mess you up, I'm sorry. Wild parsnip, we definitely have a fair amount of this, and I know that there's a lot of work going on with wild parsnip in the UP because it's in a lot of areas that people want to travel. Because wild parsnip is similar to giant hogweed in some regards in that it also can give you chemical burns with its sap. The great news about wild parsnip is that you have to break the plant and get the sap on you, unlike giant hogweed, like just brushing up against it, you can touch it, and unless you have very sensitive skin, you'd probably be safe. I touch it all the time, it's fine. But it grows in kind of wet and waste areas, so along rail to trail trails and along roadsides and in ditches is very commonly where it is. And most often you get injuries to humans because they get in there like, oh, what's all that plant? And they weed whip it, and all of that sap sprays everywhere and it gets on them, and they may even end up pretty sick about it. So if you think you see wild parsnip, don't weed whip it. Great ways to identify wild parsnip are its yellow flowers in midsummer. Again, looks a lot like a Queen Anne's lace, except it doesn't turn white. So a big disc of flowers coming up from a stem, but its leaves are quite different from a Queen Anne's lace, especially the young first year or basal leaves. You can see up here, it looks kind of more like Queen Anne's lace, kind of a leafy, ferny situation. But when they're young, they're really interesting. Those little leaflets wrap right around the midrib of this leaf. This is all one leaf. And it looks like the parsnip that you might grow in your garden because it's the same one. So if you grow parsnips in your garden, please don't let them go to flower and let those seeds get elsewhere. Again, this is it can be a harmful plant, but it's also a situation where if you get it on you, you can rinse it off with water pretty easily. You just have to be aware that you've got it on you so that you don't have a reaction, because the blisters hurt. They're no fun. But looking for that yellow kind of Queen Anne's lace flower with weird flat leaves underneath are a great way to identify it. And then there's like a million other species that we think about. We talked about Dame's Rocket. There's also money plant, which looks very similar, except it has more heart-shaped leaves, and its seed heads are very attractive to folks. So folks really enjoy that. But unfortunately, it spreads and hurts other organisms and can be a big problem. Scots pine looks like a pine tree, but a great way to identify it is, you can see here, it's got orange bark on like the top, usually 2/3 of the tree. And you can see that from like really far away and notice it. So if you see that orange bark on the top, Scots pine. Scots pine is really, really good at reproducing. It doesn't do allelopathy, but if it ends up in a pine forest, it can end up taking over because it's just so good at reproducing, and our other pines are less so. Norway maple is a very common maple in street trees again. It's been hybridized a couple different times and made into some pretty cool cultivars that have purple leaves year round. And it can look a lot like the sugar maple. Also in some, you might look at this leaf and think it's a sugar maple. Some differences from sugar maple are that it has a milky bitter sap instead of a sweet delicious sap. And it is the leaf is usually wider than it is tall. So you can see here it's wider than it is tall by a little bit. And it's also more susceptible to this black spot fungus. It doesn't kill the tree or hurt it that much, but it makes you notice it. Not that our native maples can't get this, but for whatever reason, the Norway maple is much more susceptible. So if you see a tree that's all covered in black spots, that might be it. And it's a problem, again, more so downstate, but we're seeing more and more where it has been planted ornamentally and then moves into our forests and forest edges. Spotted knapweed is a personal nemesis of mine. If you ever want to talk spotted knapweed, I would be delighted. It has these, it's also called, oh my God, I just forgot, star thistle. There we go. It's also called star thistle. And so star thistle honey is often made from spotted knapweed. It's a plant with thistle-like, it's in the thistle family, thistle-like purpley to pink to white flowers, can be just kind of about anywhere in there. And then the rest of the plant is usually rather grayish, gray-green, and not stabby, but just kind of stiff and prickly-ish. It can be a skin irritant, particularly to people with more sensitive skin, not like poison ivy, but just a skin irritant. It also tastes bad if you've been pulling it by hand and then you eat a sandwich, you'll notice the taste. That's not a good way to identify it, though. Please don't do that. It is allelopathic, and it has, again, kind of a thistle-like appearance. It does not have any thorns or spines or prickles, but just seeing that it kind of seems like a thistle, and then is very slim and has these purple flowers in usually mid-July is when it starts blooming. This is a really easy drive-by botany one. You'll see it on a lot of fallow fields, a lot of roadsides. You can drive by and be like, all those purple flowers, they're all spotted knapweed. Orange daylily is sometimes called the ditch lily or the wild lily. It is not native and really fills in those ditches, especially. It is a daylily. There are lots and lots of daylilies that are not invasive. Just the orange daylily is the one that is. So please pick one that isn't orange. Vinca or periwinkle or myrtle is a very common ground cover. And although it's not allelopathic, it does spread very thickly and very well in shaded areas, which is great for a ground cover in your garden, but really, really bad in a forest. You can see that it has not very small, but smaller and very oval, like a perfect oval kind of leaves, a little bit pointed. They're very thick with a waxy cuticle. And then especially right now, but throughout the summer, it has these purple flowers that are really, really clear. And you've seen it in gardens, and then you'll see it out in the woods. And in the woods, it doesn't flower as much, so it can be a lot harder to spot without those flowers. But if you see a big mat of dark green leaves, it could be vinca. Black locust is a tree that's native to North America, but not to Michigan. It's native to the Appalachian Mountains. And it is really good at growing both by seeds. So it has these little beans, it's in the bean family, both by seeds, and these are its flowers that'll be flowering really soon here. And then it's also capable of growing up by root shoots. And so you'll see big groves of these. And I don't usually include bark ID, but I wanted to for this plant in particular because it has this thick ropey bark with kind of an orange undertone, which you may not notice on an individual tree, but if you get into an area where like that's kind of all that's around, that's probably a black locust forest now. Usually nothing else will grow underneath it or only other invasive species. So there are some areas that we have like a black locust overstory and then a honeysuckle understory and then garlic mustard on the ground. And it's just a real bummer. It is a nitrogen fixer, which people are really excited about, of course, enriching our sandy soils in Michigan. But unfortunately, that makes it really inhospitable for our native plants. And it may be, there's some research going into if that's allelopathic as well, if it puts out chemicals that hurt other plants. Water hyacinth and water lettuce are two species that are presently annuals in Michigan, so they'll die each year. But with a change in climate, we're not sure if they will remain annuals. And even as they are annuals, they are able to grow very fast. They're both aquatic species. They're both free-floating species, so over the top of a pond. And in areas where they've escaped, most often it was like someone had a really lovely pond and then the Grand River flooded or the other river flooded and these flowers, these plants were able to escape and then they multiply and will cover the whole area. And that's a really big problem for dissolved oxygen. So looking for these cute little clusters of leaves, and the water hyacinth kind of has a bulb and then these waxy leaves and a really lovely purple flower. So watching for those in wild spaces or in ponds that could be flooded easily. Yellow flag iris, very commonly on the edge of water, as you can see here. It's important to distinguish, we have our blue flag irises that are native, and there are also German bearded irises that can come in yellow, but they've got like taller bits in the middle and a wider lower petal. And so paying attention to whether it's this style of iris or not is really, really crucial, because it's very difficult to identify this iris, this yellow flag iris, from our native wild blue iris when they're not flowering. Really, really difficult. And so paying attention during flowering season, which is June and July, is really, really important. Lily of the Valley, everyone knows what this one is when they're seeing the flowers, and then looking for those thick leaves. Similar to vinca, it's something that is really lovely in our gardens, but unfortunately often escapes into our woodlands and causes big problems. So looking for those thick, juicy leaves. We do have the Canada Mayflower, which can look like its flowers are more like little stars than little bells, and its leaves aren't so thick and juicy and are much smaller and more orbiculate, like a little shorter, fatter at the base and pointier at the tip, whereas Lily of the Valley is more of this true oval with a point. Last one on this slide, and ooh, the last plant I'm going to make you hear about is the Bishop's Goutweed, which is also called Snow on the Mountain. Another ground cover, looks like this in gardens, but when it escapes, it may keep those white edges or it may revert to fully green, which is another thing that can make it pretty hard to identify. It does have these 3-lobed leaves, and if you can find it with the variegations, like, oh, that's definitely what it is. But if you have found it where it's reverted to green, you'll look at it and just be like, oh gosh, I'm not sure. But again, if it's covering an area really thickly, even if it's not invasive, it might be something to take note of, and it may very well be this Bishop's Goutweed. And boy, is it a doozy. And there are more, but I tried to keep it somewhat reasonable, which was still way too many. So hooray, hope all your brains aren't draining out. I did promise some treatment, so we'll take a break to talk about treatment here for a little bit before I talk to you about some non-plant species. Yay! So the biggest part of any kind of treatment is, of course, prevention. Not planting invasive species, cleaning your boots, your gear, your pets, your whatever. Always super crucial. Using those boot brush stations when you find them. We have a lot of them here in Northwest Michigan. We're so lucky. But also, you know, being able to carry maybe a pocket boot brush, which is technically a hoof pick from horse stuff. Having one of those on hand can be super duper useful, or even just like stomping your feet really well and brushing off any seeds before you get into the car. You know, you don't need special tools to do this. This is something that you can do really easy. And I really can't emphasize enough what a big difference this can make. Of course, not moving firewood, of course, reporting, and using, if you're able to, there are programs with certified hay and forage and certified gravel that are weed free. So if you are able to use those, that's always great. But prevention is the cheapest, most effective, and easiest way to combat invasive species. Otherwise, you can do manual for a lot of these species. You can pull them out, you can dig them out, you can cut them, you can use the puller bear that we can loan to you, or other partners have that'll help you wrench some of those big shrubs. Some folks have cut down shrubs and put really thick plastic, and they sell these buckthorn baggies over the stump to help that stump not grow. If you do a mowing program where you're mowing regularly so that these, especially shrubs or other species, don't get a chance to reproduce, you can make a really big difference. And if you do pull them out, you know, you can leave them in a pile, you can send them to the landfill, or you can do something called tarping, where you place the pulled plants under a tarp and leave it there to rot, because if you put a lot of these into your compost, you'll be sad. You can also tarp over areas, and this has been somewhat effective for a lot of these ground cover species, is put a tarp, weigh it down over these ground covers and let it sit, and then take it off and let them sprout and then put it back on, like, ha, I tricked you. So those are also really great manual options for how to treat these species. Oh, I didn't get a picture. There was a picture of the purple loosestrife larva earlier, beetle larva, but there are biological controls for some species. Not that many, because we have a lot of science to do to make sure that things don't go wrong. And there are lots and lots of horror stories about how biological controls have gone wrong. But we have some really great biological control for the purple loosestrife. And we use those beetles. It's really nice because it costs like a couple $100 once every 3 years, because they won't. The problem with biological controls is they won't, hunt the species into extinction, but they do bring it down to a manageable level where you can coexist and then release some more beetles later. So it's really fantastic to not have to try to treat all of the purple loosestrife because we have beetles on our side. There are some other ones. The spotted knotweed weevils apparently work great out west, and that's really exciting. But here in the Midwest and the Great Lakes region, they have been spotted on some of our native thistles, and in particular the pitcher's thistle, which is a really precious endemic species to the Great Lakes. It doesn't grow anywhere else, and so those weevils are not great for our region, but really cool for other regions. There are other species that are in the works. They're looking at biocontrols for Japanese knotweed. They're looking for biocontrols for tree of heaven. They're looking for biocontrols for a lot of stuff. And the problem is that they have to find a species that won't eat anything else. And still, do enough harm to have it be useful. So it's a lot of work, but there is research being done on that. And we are learning as much as we can as that information is available. Getting into chemical treatments and herbicide treatments for woody species like trees and shrubs and vines. You can certainly do a foliar spray where you're spraying onto the plant. You can also do a cut stump, which is what we do most of the time. And so when it's a smaller shrub or stump, you cut the shrub down, and if it's small, you can put a little bit of herbicide on basically the whole stump. But if you cut down a tree, you don't need to slather the whole thing in herbicide. You just do the outside part because that's the part that's alive. So this is really nice because it allows us to really target where we're using our herbicide. There's a very low risk of any drift or any off target because you're able to really aim at where you want to be. It's also really great because it's something that you can do in the fall and winter. You don't have to do it during the growing season. And actually the spring is a bad time to do it. Once the buds have opened up, you'll want to move on to other treatments. There are also some other options. You can do frill cuts and you can do injections and all sorts of different things. But for most folks, the cut stump is the easiest to understand and to execute. And so that's the one we suggest the most often. Herbaceous species like garlic mustard and spotted knotweed, you have a couple different options for chemical. You can, of course, do a broadcast spray where you're spraying everything. But most often, we and other invasive species managers use a spot spray. You just spray the plants that are naughty, and it lets you be more targeted. It lets you use less herbicide and make that herbicide go farther, and also just allows some really targeted treatments, which is great. Of course, you can also do mechanical for those things. We do have some more difficult species, so I wanted to highlight those a little bit. For invasive knotweeds, pulling and digging and burning are all really bad and anger it and make it worse. So only a few herbicides really work still, and you have to do a good job. You can do some mechanical work, like if you wanted to mow it or cut it, you could cut it like once or twice a month, every month for like 10 years, and it does work. Like I've seen it happen, but it's going to be a very long-term commitment. Herbicides enable us to bring that large population down to a small population very quickly. So you can see here was the population of Japanese knotweed, and using herbicides, and then we just had a couple little babies springing up there. Usually we use a foliar spray. There are also options for doing an injection or even a cut stem. Although again, because Japanese knotweed can sprout from any of those nodes where the leaves come off, cutting the plant is always a risk. Phragmites is in a similar situation. Again, you remember me talking about those rhizomes, and so physical or mechanical treatments are often not recommended because you can just spread it or make it angry. with the exception that very small populations, there are some treatments that can be pretty effective. And so if we run into those, we work with those people directly. Again, it still takes some commitment of getting out there regularly, but it can be a possibility. With the Phragmites, it's often a foliar spray, so spraying over the top, but you can also do a wipe of herbicide onto it. So again, if it's a smaller population, you can just get the Phragmites and leave all of the other plants nearby. And again, very successful treatments for them. And luckily, that's usually like a 2, maybe 3 year. Japanese knotweed, even with herbicide, you bring it down very quickly, but then to get it fully dead usually takes a little closer to 5 years. And then I mentioned that black locust and tree of heaven can do their root sucker sprouting. And so what we would usually recommend for trees or shrubs is that cut stump treatment. But because of those root suckers, those cut stump treatments aren't very effective. So instead, we recommend a hack and squirt. And you can see that here where they've hacked into the bark, as the name suggested, and then squirted some herbicide in. And it's important that these cuts don't touch so that the tree is still alive and able to translocate that herbicide both up and down into the tree, out into those root suckers, so that it kills the whole tree and not just this one big tree and making all those little root suckers angry and doing more stuff. You can also do foliar spray on these species, but it's really only recommended for those little ones that you can like stand over and spray. There are a lot of great resources for treatment. So again, this was not a treatment webinar, but if you would like to, the Midwest Invasive Plant Network Control Database is fantastic. The forum on the Michigan Invasive Species Coalition has lots of great information. MISN has some great information, and then this book, Invasive Plants of the Upper Midwest, has some fantastic strategies for control, as well as identification. It's a great book. And MISN, of course, also has some good identification. So now that I taught you all about killing stuff, let's go on to our non-plant invasive species that are great to have a look out for. One of them is oak wilt. What you'll see a lot of the time here is discoloration of leaves and bronzing, and then all of a sudden, in one month or less, all of the leaves fall off the tree. It only affects oaks and mainly affects red oaks. White oaks seem to be less susceptible. Once the tree has died, the following year you can look for pressure pads, and this on the tree itself, it's just like this weird kind of damp bulge, and then if you cut it off, you'll see this kind of black spot with white fuzz in the middle, and it smells kind of sweet, kind of weird. So that could be another way, again, if you're a smelling person, that's a great way to do it. There are some other common oak problems like oak decline that just happen a little more gradually. Oak wilt, as you can see here, so this was a tree that got oak wilt and it died in that season, and then it was able to infect the trees nearby it. And so those next oaks are dying this season, and then they'll spread out to the next oaks. And so it's this kind of cyclical pattern. And so there are some regulations out now about not trimming oaks during the season to slow the spread of this species. But again, there are some lookalikes, and the key things to look for are just a sudden drop of all of the leaves in a month, usually June, I believe. And then the next year, looking for those pressure pads. Asian longhorn beetle, not here in Michigan yet, but we're very much on the lookout for it because it is in Ohio. It's a big beetle, and it is black and white and has all these spots on it, and has really cool antenna and kind of blue feet. It's got all sorts of stuff going on. Its larva is pretty huge, and its exit holes when it leaves after being a larva and emerging as an adult is very large, perfectly circular, and big enough to put a pencil into. We do have a native lookalike, and that is the white spotted pine sawyer beetle. And this can be tricky because this Asian longhorn beetle sure has some spots. The difference is the white spotted pine sawyer beetle spots are usually pretty diffuse. You can see that they don't have hard lines around them. And we're also looking at this white spot right here, where the two wing covers, the elytra, come together. There's a white spot. And on the Asian longhorn beetle, there is no white spot there. So that is hard to tell on like a moving species, like, oh, come back here. But if you are able to look at a picture of it, it's very easy to tell, like, oh, does it have that white spot? Yes, no, that's the most common. There are other longhorn beetles that are black and might have spots that might make it a little tricky, but that is kind of the key there. And then, you know, you might not see the beetle, so looking for those big exit holes that you could stick a pencil into can be really key. Hemlock woolly adelgid is a little tiny insect, a true bug that we at ISN have become more familiar with in the last couple of years. This is what the insect looks all on its own, just this itty bitty, just very nearly microscopic tiny plant, or tiny insect, excuse me. It embeds itself at the base of needles on hemlock trees. So if it's a balsam fir tree, it's not it. There's also a balsam woolly adelgid, fun facts. So it has to be on a hemlock tree. And as the year progresses, especially in January through March, it will slowly create these little woolly sacs of wax around to protect itself. And so that is the best time to look for this. It's not that you couldn't find it the rest of the year, it's just harder to see. A lot of times that may deteriorate. And also the crawlers are more active. So this is the adult, but when it is a juvenile, it's crawling around. Once it's embedded, it doesn't go anywhere. It's never going to leave again. But those little woolly sacs around them are the key thing to pay attention to. Again, only on hemlock trees. And then here's a picture from out east where they've had huge hemlock die-off. We're pretty early in this situation, and HWA, which is what we usually call it because it's this long word, is moving pretty slowly. A couple of lookalikes, you might get some spider ovisacs, you might get some beech bark disease fluff, or even some bits of snow. So the really important thing is, like, if you shake the branch, does it come off? Yes, okay, but then it was probably something else. And is it, you can see with all of these that they're not in quite the right place. You know, we're really looking at right at the base of the needles, right there, only there, not along the needle, not in a place where there isn't a needle. That's the only place that they would be, is right at the base of those needles. And we have a special way to report HWA, so I'll get back to that a little later. Feral swine, another, oh, didn't think I was going to talk about mammals, you thought wrong. If you see hairy pigs running around, the DNR wants to know about that because they're really destructive. And so keep an eye out for that, and try to log any sign you see. Their tracks can seem pretty similar to white-tailed deer, especially in softer soils. But just watching out, or just looking for hairy pigs, you know, that's always good to watch out for, because these things can really damage our natural resources. We do have feral hogs in Michigan. We do not yet have nutria rats in Michigan, but they are found further south and can do some serious damage to our wetlands. So we're definitely trying to look out for them. It's something that kind of looks like a muskrat, but it's like 3 times the size and has a different tail, like almost as big as a beaver, but without the beaver tail. So just watching for that. Again, you know, we don't have any of those in Michigan yet, but we won't know unless we look for them. So our OUSs are real. So thinking about, oh my gosh, I did not see what time it was. Thinking about reporting, you can use GPS units. They're all a little different. And phones and tablets can be really great. We use specifically the Midwest Invasive Species Information Network's code when we use GPS units. So we use the location, our initials, so we know who to ask questions about, what species it was, give it a number, and then have an area density and treatment status. We'll talk more about this in person. You can also use the MISN app, so you don't have to go through all this. You can do it on your phone, it's free. But so for example, this is a Benzie County, Katie Grishak. PE means the butterbur. And so you have to look up and know what species it is. And it was the first one I found. It was a small area, but a thick density, and it wasn't treated. So that's what that means. And then you can upload those into MISN. So of course, you can also go right onto the website. You don't have to use your phone. If you don't want them on your phone, you can go onto the website at misn.msu.edu and go through, select the species and report. MISN also has some really great training modules. If you're like, wow, Katie didn't talk enough about how to identify tree of heaven. The training modules are absolutely amazing. And they have them for lots and lots of species, and they'll go through and walk you through what are some lookalikes? What are things to look for? Where might you find it? There's a lot of information and some great photos in there. Also, you can do your reporting there, and you can zoom right in, whether using the map or telling it where to look yourself. And then it'll ask you all those questions so you don't have to remember the code, which is really nice. You can also bulk upload your reports to MISN if you do use the codes. You can also get onto MISN, and rather than going through those training modules, you can just go to the species pages, and they've got them for like so many species, and right in there you'll see lots of pictures, really clear descriptions, and the ability then to share that information, which is really, really fantastic. You can also go on under species information and browse data and go, where is this species found? And you can see all the reports of where this species has been found, and you can do this all through your phone as well. And even zooming in to see where it was. And in some cases, if you're logged in, which I highly recommend getting a membership, it's free. It'll even tell you in some cases who reported it, if it was an organization. They won't tell you individuals. It won't be like Jim did this, but it does allow you to know if it's a trusted source, no matter what. And then again, you can do all of this except for the training modules through the app as well. Reporting, looking at the species to be sure you know what you're talking about, taking pictures and submitting them with your report. This app is really fantastic, so that if you aren't sure but you think it's a honeysuckle, you can take that picture and then experts can check it out and see like, oh yeah, that's definitely what it was. I did mention that HWA has a different reporting situation, and that is through this link, which is something that we developed with, well, I mean, Eyes on the Forest developed it and we helped. And this allows you to say, I went hiking and I didn't see HWA, or I think I might have, and then asks you to give a photo. Please don't take any samples of HWA because it is kind of restricted, especially in areas where there is a quarantine. And you can use it on your computer or on your phone, and it will notify us when you find it. So this is really great in areas particularly where HWA surveys aren't happening, but you want to get out there and see what you can find anyway. So flipping over those branches, looking for the HWA, it's just a little bit easier. You don't need a login for this one, unlike MISN where you do have to create a login. All right. Whoa, right on the nose. Any questions?
There's none recent. I've been answering a few like little questions as they've come up in the chat that I think people are keeping up with, but there's nothing.
Are there any of those questions we want to share so that folks watching this recording might know about?
Yeah, there was a question about like how to remove lilies of the valley once they're established. So you could maybe
hard work,
root ones.
Yeah.
And then just similar ones about like how to remove certain like ground covers, lily of the valley, that sort of thing. So along the same line.
Gotcha. Great. Well, any other questions?
Yeah, one just came up actually. Does ISN monitor MISN? If we find a priority species, is it enough to upload to MISN or better to let you know directly?
Either way is great. Anybody can sign up to get alerts from MISN if you would like to. So I personally am signed up to get all alerts in our 4 counties. So if you report something to MISN and it's an invasive species, I will hear about it. And so especially for those priority species, if you report autumn olive, I'm gonna be like, oh man, bummer. But if you report Chinese yam, I'm going to go check that, or maybe not I personally, but ISN will figure out how to get more information on that very quickly. So, but you can also reach out to us directly, or if you're from somewhere else with your SISMA, that's also certainly an option. It's not like only MISN, I'm not going to respond to you, but going through MISN is completely appropriate. Great question.
That's all I'm seeing for now.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. And I hope I'll be able to see some of you in the field in a couple weeks to get out and get some of that hands-on ID. You know, pictures are great, but it's always better to get a little dirt under your nails. So thanks very much for joining us.